welcome to today's podcast. I'm Granny Rhea.
And I'm Auntie Donia.
And we're here to talk about super special kids and cake.
Yes, cake!
We're coming to you from the studios of Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. This podcast is brought to you by our book, Let's Talk, Social Communicative Services and Supports for Your Young Child with ASD, published by Paul H. Brooks and available from Amazon.
Auntie Donia, what's our super special topic for the week?
It's about speech sounds and when they develop. So when do little children begin to make the different speech sounds that they need to use, and what order do they come in?
Well, that's a great question, Auntie Donia, and I'm sure a lot of parents have that question, especially parents of super special kids, because very often they do things a little bit differently than other kids do. But, before I can answer that question, I really feel like I need to do a little bit of explaining. As speech-language pathologists, we're kind of fussy about the way we use words, and one of the words we're super fussy about is speech. Speech means something special to those of us in the biz. We talk about speech as being the way people pronounce and produce the sounds of language. And we differentiate that from the ideas that they want to express and the rules for putting sentences together and the rules for knowing what words mean. Those are not part of speech for us. For us, speech just means articulating or pronouncing the sounds of words so that the words can be understood.
And Granny Rhea, depending on the language that a child is speaking, there are going to be some sounds that are going to be in their language and some that aren't. So we often will hear adult speakers who they're not native speakers, for example, of English, who won't necessarily pronounce the sounds of the words in the same way. So they may say, for example, instead of the people, it may be the Bibel.
Mm-hmm. Or, for example, if they're native German speakers, they might turn all the W's into V's and say things like the Weit Walker instead of White Walker. So this idea that speech is connected to the language that you learn is a very important one. Different languages take advantage of different sounds that are available for us to use.
And I always find it fascinating, Granny Rhea, that if you think of languages across the world, that most languages, mama, baba, dada represent mummy, daddy, grandma. Why is that?
Yeah, that's so interesting, Auntie Donia. I was just thinking about that this morning because I learned the Hindi word for mother this morning. And you know what it is? It's Ami.
Ami.
So most languages throughout the world have words for mother that have an M in them because those are one of the first sounds that babies make. And so parents, liking to think that their children are talking about them, will attach the word mama to that first pronunciation that the child makes. And so across the world, whether it's mama or ima or Ami, those words that mean mother are going to have the M sound. Same thing for dada. Across the world, most words for father have either a P or a D because the P's and the D's are the second sounds that children typically develop. And as human beings, we like to think that children are talking to us. So when we hear them say dada, we think they must be mean daddy. And eventually the language adopts that word for daddy. So in English, we have daddy. In French, we have papa. What are some Arabic words for father?
Baba, papa, abi.
Yes, and in Hebrew, it's abba. So again, those same sounds turn up because those are the first sounds that kids say.
And I suppose it's easy for kids to see those sounds as well because they're the ones made by the lips and, they can see those, the way the lips are moving to make those sounds too.
Right. So all children learn sounds in a relatively predictable sequence. and at about the same time. And generally, up until around 24 months of age, children will make the same kinds of sounds that they made when they were babbling. Even though they weren't using them meaningfully, those early sounds migrate into their first words. By 3, most children can produce all the vowels in their language. And by 4, most of them can produce almost all the consonants, although they're still making some errors. For example, in English, we have special errors that are very common.
Yes, in fact, one Halloween, a little girl rang the doorbell, and when I opened, she said, "Twick or tweet."
So she was an early Twitter fan, right?
Exactly, that's right. Tweeting at a young age.
Right. But for typically developing children, by 4, most of the time, most people can understand what they say, even though they might make a few errors that persist on some sounds that are particularly hard, like R's and S's and THs. But super special kids, of course, are a little bit different. First of all, it may take them longer to work out all those sounds. So they may continue to make errors on sounds for a longer period of time. And sometimes that makes their speech hard to understand. So on top of whatever other problems they might have, they sometimes have difficulty communicating with other people because their speech isn't intelligible. Other people can't understand it.
And I think we also want to remember that for our super special kids, communication is really the key. And if you have a little one who's still struggling with their speech sounds, we really want to make sure they're able to communicate their ideas. And we've spoken about this before, where we've suggested that you can use gestures or signs to help the super special kids. So if they are saying the same word, or it sounds like the same word, sometimes that happens for the same thing, that co is for cookie, but it's also used for go, then if they've got the gesture or the sign, that helps them to be a little bit more intelligible too.
Yeah, so any way we can augment what the child is able to say to help them be more understood by those around them is going to be useful to them. Now, some parents who work with speech language pathologists find that the SLPs want to use what they call AAC, augmentative and alternative approaches to communication. And this very often means using pictures or pointing to pictures on an iPad that can then speak the name of the picture and so on. And sometimes parents are jittery about this. They worry that it's going to keep the child from talking. What's your experience with that, Auntie Donia?
I've actually found it to be the opposite, that when we introduce either sign language or we've introduced an iPad, that the child has actually started to produce more sounds. And this happened very recently with a 3-year-old that I was working with autism, and he recently learned 4 or 5 new signs. So he's learned the sign for open, he learnt the sign for cookie, and a couple of other ones as well. But what we also started noticing is that his speech production increased as well. So the sounds that he was making, his repertoire of sounds also increased.
Yeah, because it seems what happens is that for some super special kids, it's hard for them to understand what all those noises people are making mean. And so they just don't sort of get the whole idea. But once you start giving them a picture as a way to communicate, and they see that by giving someone the picture, they can get the thing they want, or pointing to a picture on an iPad that says a word for them, and other people then can respond to that word. Once they get that idea, what I like to call the speech insight, that speech means something and can regulate other people's behavior. Once they get that idea, suddenly the whole thing starts to make more sense to them, and it allows them to tune in to what other people are saying and to take more advantage of the speech that they're exposed to. And that sometimes does lead to their talking on their own.
Is there an age, Granny Rhea, where you feel that if a child still isn't producing the speech sounds, that perhaps a parent would need to have some help, seek help or advice?
Well, the rule of thumb in our practice is that children should be mostly intelligible by the time they're 4. So if a child is 3 and is still not very easy to understand, generally we're going to want to give them a little more time, unless they're frustrated and angry about it. And if the child is unhappy about being able to communicate, that I think is the time to bring in an assessment or think about going to a speech language pathologist. But if the 3-year-old is perfectly happy to prattle along and nobody understands much of what she says, it's perfectly fine to wait until they get to be 4. 4 is kind of a boundary, I think, that children should, who are typical now. I'm not talking about super special kids here, but I'm talking about typically developing kids. They should have some speech, intelligible speech, by the time they're 4. Again, for our super special kids, it takes longer. And sometimes we just have to persist a little longer with patience and good modeling because they may not be ready to do the very detailed motor work that it takes to really correct speech.
And I think good modeling there, Granny Rhea, is a really important word. So I always encourage parents and caregivers to actually use the right word. So if the child is saying, oh, look, it's a Tismus tea, that you wouldn't think, I mean, it may sound adorable, but you make sure that you say, yes, you're right, it is a tree. It's a very tall tree, so that you're always using the right model.
Yes, using the right model is very important, really, for all of the input that we give to children. I like to tell parents that even though their child won't understand it, they should still always hear full sentences. For example, rather than saying, get ball, I like to tell parents it's a better idea to say get the ball, because even though the child may not be able to say the at this point, it's going to create a slot in their mind image of that sentence, and eventually they're going to figure out that something needs to go into that slot. So I think giving good models for both speech and the language part of the message is important. Just one more thing about super special kids in speech, Auntie Donia. Many of them do have a lot of difficulty with speech. And I know parents can be frustrated with their speech or feel that people aren't helping them enough with their speech. Very often, as speech language pathologists, we hear parents say, well, all I want is for him to talk. And of course, we understand that, and it's perfectly natural for parents to feel that way. But I think we would say that giving the child some other way to communicate at first, along with providing those good models, can be a great way to give them at least their best chance of talking.
So, Granny Rhea, let's see what one of our listeners has sent us for today's super special question.
So, Auntie Donia, have we got a super special question this time?
We have. Someone asked me this week that their child gets very upset when he sees unfamiliar adults. And this started after his pediatrician came to the house for a home visit. And his mum told me that he got very upset and started crying. And when they went to visit some family, the same thing happened because there were people that he didn't know.
That's a tough situation for a parent to be in, because you don't want the child to be anxious and upset every time someone new comes into the house. What strategies work for that, Auntie Donia?
Well, a couple of things that I suggested for the mum is, first of all, if they're going somewhere and there's someone new that's going to be there, that they either let their child know that we're going to go to this place and you're going to see the name of the person, if mum knows that person is going to be there, and if possible, to share some photographs. So even if it is, a doctor coming, or you're going to go and visit the hairdressers or the barbers, it's a good idea to have a photograph beforehand.
Yeah, you know what's great about today? Almost every business has a website. So you can go there and you can show kids the pictures of the people. You can even show them pictures of the store if they're going to a new store or a new doctor's office. We have so many resources now to help prime our children to get ready to have new experiences.
We really do. And sometimes things in our schedule change. And so if you don't have the time, let's say, for example, you're going to lunch and then you're told, actually, the doctor's arrived early, so you have to go, take your child to see the doctor that's just arrived for a home visit. It's okay to say, I know we were going to have lunch, but, Dr. Marty just came and we're going to go and see Dr. Marty because he wants to have a look in your mouth.
Yeah, and again, using some sort of visual priming can be helpful. I know it's hard in the press of getting from one place to another throughout your day, but even if you can just open up your iPad and say, "Oh gosh, we've got a super special surprise. Dr. Marty's here early. Hooray, we get to see him before lunch, and then we'll get to go out for lunch and maybe we can go to McDonald's." So you can structure these situations so that there is a reward for the child at the end.
And sometimes when we take a closer look at why the child may be upset, it may actually not be the unfamiliar adult. It may be what they're expected to do in the presence of the unfamiliar adult. So sometimes if the expectation is say hello or give that person a hug or a kiss, and the child simply doesn't want to do that, then that could be also another possible trigger. So it's a little bit like unraveling a mystery where you really want to take a closer look and see, I wonder why this is happening.
Yeah, that's very true, Auntie Donia. And behaviorists call that process doing a functional behavior assessment, where they just try to figure out what's at the root of this behavior that's a problem for the child. Because if we figure out what causes it, then we can do something about that cause rather than waiting until the child gets really upset and then having to deal with a temper tantrum. So the whole idea of figuring out what's at the root of the child's maladaptive behavior can be very important in helping to prevent it. Auntie Donia, there are so many myths and misconceptions in working with children with developmental disabilities. And some of them are so absurd, they just make us go, arghhh!
Granny Rhea, what's our thing that makes us go, oh,
Arghhh. Well, it's kind of a touchy subject, Auntie Donia. But something that really makes me crazy is when people come up to parents of super special kids and say something like, "Oh, that child was given to you because you're strong enough to handle him," or "That child is a special gift." It just is. I know that people are trying to be kind by saying it, and they're trying to be positive, and of course we want to appreciate that. But you know, if you're the parent of a super special kid, you don't feel chosen. Nobody volunteers for this job, that's for sure. And everyone has to do what they can and what they have to do. And so it just doesn't help for people to try to always find a silver lining when we know sometimes having a super special kid is something that we're just sad about. And I think what's really important is that we acknowledge those feelings and allow ourselves to feel them, because if we don't, we won't have the strength to give this child the support that he's going to need over a long period of time.
And I think that's really important, Granny Rhea, that you, as a parent of a super special kid, you have the right to feel sad, to feel uncomfortable, and actually to sometimes feel angry. And I think sometimes there's so much shame associated with being angry, but in order to be able to heal and to be able to deal with the everyday things that will come up, and it's definitely a journey that where you continue to have a roller coaster of emotions, I think it's important to really be able to acknowledge.
Yeah, to acknowledge the complicated feelings that we have about super special children. Because, of course, some of it is joyful, and the love that you get from a super special child is really different from the love you get from a typically developing child, and it has its own beauty and its own joy. But at the same time, it's a very hard job, and it's a very demanding job, and it's one that lasts for a long time. And I think as parents, it's really important to acknowledge that this isn't all fun, and it isn't all positive, and it certainly isn't all fair.
And just striking that balance, as you said, that it's not always fun and it's not always fair, but utilizing the supports that you have around you, finding the friend or the person that is going to listen, because sometimes you just want to be listened to. You don't need somebody to give you the solution or tell you it's all going to be okay. You just want to say, I had a terrible day today and this is what's happened.
Yeah, that's really true. And of course, you can have a terrible day with your typically developing kids too. That's not unique to super special kids. But there is a certain sadness that goes along with understanding that your child will have certain kinds of limitations throughout life. But the other thing to remember is that sometimes that things that seem like limitations to us might not seem the same way to a super special child. Sometimes they can find satisfaction and joy in the interests or the activities of which they're capable, even though they might not be what we had initially envisioned for them. But sometimes they can still be a source of happiness.
Granny Rhea, there is nothing wrong with eating cake for breakfast.
You are so right, Auntie Donia, and we're going to be talking about some things that are as much fun as eating cake for breakfast. So, Auntie Donia, tell us about our cake for breakfast today.
So our cake for breakfast today is visiting markets and fairs. So often you will find that you have these farmers markets and pop-up fairs that come up in different towns and cities. And this can be a really great opportunity to share the fun. So something that you can do with your super special kid that they can enjoy too.
What kinds of things do super special kids tend to enjoy a lot about these fairs, Auntie Donia?
I think it's a variety of different things. So if you think of some of these food markets, they actually get to see sometimes really unusual pumpkins and corn, and they sometimes get to hear different music and being around people that they wouldn't necessarily see. And it's very different to being in a supermarket where it can be the echoey and there can be a lot of different scents that are there as well.
And the fluorescent lights
and the
are not so nice.
Exactly. So being outdoors and where they're actually experiencing and they're allowed to touch, well, depending on what it is. Sometimes, right? They're allowed to touch some of the food items or the different things that are being sold.
Sometimes the farmer's market, though, can be overstimulating, just like the supermarket. Have you got any advice along those lines?
I think, again, we've spoken about priming before, and I think it's always important to prepare the children for what's going to be expected, what they're going to perhaps see. And I would also set some kind of time limit too and say, we're going to go to the market for half an hour or for 45 minutes. And even if your child doesn't have the true understanding of that concept, you do. So you're not pressurizing yourself to have to stay and walk around the market for a very long time.
True. And also thinking about what's going to be at the market, what's likely to tempt your child. Are there things that she's going to want to bring home, and how can we manage that? So, for example, you might talk with the child before you go to the market about buying only 2 things that she can bring home, and she should decide ahead of time. And you can give her some choices about what's likely to be there. There'll be candy, and there'll be popcorn, and there'll be cider, and there'll be donuts. Which 2 things should we pick to bring home? And let's make sure we get those on our list. That way you can avoid conflicts when the child sees something new that she wants.
And I've had to do that with my nieces and nephews too, where I say, Auntie Donnie's only going to buy you 2 things. And sometimes I'm instructed not to buy anything that's sweet or candy by mummies and daddies as well. And then just to avoid meltdowns, as you're ending your time, you really want to prime the children again. So you're saying something along the lines of, we finished at the market, we've had a fun day, we're going to go to the car, or we're going to go on the bus, and then we're going to head home, so that you're preparing them again for what's to come.
Yes, and you can even pick out certain landmarks that you're going to pass on the way so the child can kind of pick them out and recognize them. Remember, we saw the eggplant stand. We're going to go past the eggplant stand again on the way to the car. Let's see if you can find it. Really, what we're saying, and this applies to so many situations, is that you can often avoid trouble by doing some preventive work in the beginning, some priming that lets the child know what to expect. And for many of our super special kids, what really bothers them is the unexpected. And if they know what's going to happen and we stick closely to the script, very often we can avoid some of those maladaptive behaviors. Auntie Donia, is it time for cake?
It is time for cake. So today we have a gluten-free pumpkin muffin that's actually from the farmer's market in Union Square in New York.
Cool.
So ready to try it?
Let's eat cake.
Let's eat cake.
The Let's Talk About Super Special Kids and Cake podcast would like to thank our host, Sacred Heart University's School of Communication and Media Studies. We'd also like to thank our composer, Marty Eisenberg, our editor, Brent, and our